let's look at lymphomas. So we'll be looking at a generalised pattern for these in cytology specimens. So characteristically, lymphomas are always arranged in a dispersed pattern with single cells. Here's a typical example. So it's almost like a monolayer of cells spread across the slide. None of them are forming really cohesive groups or anything remotely organised. So there are some cells that are touching each other, but they're not growing together or forming a community border in the sense of like a gland or anything like that. Another case, in this case they're a little more clumped, so it's not quite as individual a cell, and that's partly a smearing artifact. This is a PAP, and it's showing a nice, maybe the odd clump, but a nice single cell presentation. The cells are all lying out there on their own. This occasionally happens. So in this case, the cells are clumped together a little bit, and see how they're almost moulding around each other. So that can be problematic in distinguishing this from a neuroendocrine carcinoma, but it should be just focal, and so it's really just a sort of preparation artifact, and it certainly shouldn't be all over the slide. You can see here most of the cells are individual, and especially where they've got cytoplasm, they're lying out pretty much on their own and not growing together. So cytoplasm with lymphoid cells is usually quite sparse, and they have a high NC ratio. Normally you can just see like a blue crescent moon shaped rim of cytoplasm around them, especially on the diff-quick slides. It can be difficult to see on PAP slides cytoplasm on lymphoid cells sometimes. The other thing you will see sometimes are little fragments of cytoplasm in the background of slides with lymphoma, and those are called lymphoid globules. We'll look at those. Here's some examples. You can see the cytoplasm, just a little rim around some of these. Many of them appear not to have much. Those little dots beside my arrow are lymphoid globules. And notice how each of them has just a small tail of cytoplasm, sometimes, or else just that crescent-shaped cytoplasm. Another good example, so you can see just that small amount of cytoplasm around the outside. So very high NC ratio. Often the stain is more intense around the periphery of the cell as well, as you can see in those couple. One more example, and again the same thing. So many of these don't have terribly apparent cytoplasm, but when you focus on one or two you can see that small rim of cytoplasm around the outside of the cell. Some of them, like these, will have a little more cytoplasm and be approaching like a plasmacytoid appearance. Here's one. The larger cells appear to not have much cytoplasm, but you can notice on the bottom these cells definitely have that lymphoid cytoplasm to them, and another good example here. So often it's a matter of chasing around a bit, especially in the high grade lymphomas, to make sure you can identify cells as being definitely lymphoid based on that cytoplasm, and the air-dried slides are definitely the best to look for. So nucleoli comparatively have little variation in size and shape, certainly compared to high-grade carcinomas and usually to neuroendocrine carcinomas. They usually maintain a fairly round, at least on low power, appearance. Often when you go into high power you can see there's quite a lot of irregularity to the nuclear membranes, with indents and cleavages and sometimes little projections around the nuclear membrane. Chromatin is varied, but sometimes you get what people describe as a kind of blocky chromatin, which I have trouble describing, but you'll see it in a moment. And nucleoli vary quite a lot, so sometimes it won't be apparent, sometimes there'll be multiple nucleoli present. So these cells appear basically round, but when you look at them more closely, there are quite a number that in fact most of them have some irregularity to the nuclear membrane. You can see little indentations like this one in the outline of nuclei often. There's another one there showing sort of an invagination of the nuclear membrane. Another example here. And so once you start looking around, you see that many of them are actually quite irregular in outline. Just a further case here, and notice how so many of these really don't have a perfectly round outline to the nucleus. It's often irregular, sometimes indented. This is a pap stain. It's much harder to see the nuclear detail in these, but we can appreciate the chromatin and nucleoli probably more than others. And notice these ones here have what appears to be multiple nucleoli present in them, and many of the cells in this specimen at least have fairly prominent nucleoli. This is an example of that blocky sort of chromatin that you see sometimes, and it's sort of coarse and gives like a sort of checkerboard almost appearance to the nucleus, but as I say, it's quite variable. This is an example of a high-grade lymphoma, and in these it is difficult differential sometimes to determine what sort of cell type this is. So this could be a poorly differentiated carcinoma or a neuroendocrine carcinoma, for example. So it's important to identify like that cell there that has a rim of cytoplasm around it. Notice this one has in the background what appear to be definitely mature lymphocytes as well. But so I'm looking around really, that's one's looking for some of these larger, obviously malignant cells that might have lymphoid cytoplasm. And I think you can see a few of them around. There's a plasma cell there on the right hand side, but these guys here certainly seem to have that little rim of cytoplasm on them. There's a little mature, probably lymphocytes there. Often a matter of scouting around to find a cell or two that you are happy, definitely lymphoid. So that's high-grade lymphoma. Easy to make a diagnosis of malignancy, but much harder to type. So in summary, really the major differential diagnosis with lymphoma lies with neuroendocrine carcinomas, as I talked about in that clip. So important to really check out the Giems's and see if there's moulding present, and it's the nuclei that are moulding, not just the cell. Look for that lymphoid cytoplasm. Other things that can produce this similar sort of single cell pattern and mimic lymphoma include poorly differentiated carcinomas, and of course melanoma is always in the mix as well.